Chapter 13. Coming up to the tree, I could see it was a huge bur oak. It wasn't tall. It was just the opposite, rather low and squatty. The top was a thick mass of large limbs, and it hadn't shed all its leaves yet. It stood by itself in an old field. There were no other trees within 50 yards of it, and about 15 feet to the left were the remains of an old barbed wire fence. An old gate hung by one rusty hinge from a large corner post. I could tell that at one time a house had stood close by. Reuben saw me looking around. "Long time ago, some Indians lived here and farmed these fields," he said. I walked around the tree looking for the coon, but could see very little in the dark shadows. "Ain't no use to look," he said. "He won't be there." Rainey spoke up. "This ain't the first time that we've been to this tree," he said. Reuben told Rainey to shut up. "You talk too much," he said. In a whining voice, Rainey said, "Reuben, you know that coon ain't in that tree. Make him pay off and let's go home. I'm a-getting tired." I told Reuben I was going to climb the tree. "Go ahead," he said. "Won't do any good." The tree was easy to climb. I looked all over it on each limb and in every dark place. I looked for a hollow. The ghost coon wasn't there. I climbed back down, scolded old Dan to stop his loud bawling, and looked for little Ann. I saw her far up the old fence row, sniffing and running here and there. I knew the ghost coon had pulled a real trick, but I couldn't figure out what it was. Little Ann had never yet barked treed. I knew if the coon was in the tree, she wouldn't still be searching for the trail. Old Dan started working again. My dogs covered the field. They circled and circled. They ran up and down the barbed wire fence on both sides. I knew the coon hadn't walked the barbed wire. Ghost or no ghost, he couldn't do that. I walked over to the old gate and looked around. I sat down and stared up in the tree, and Little Ann came to me. Old Dan, giving up his search, came back to the tree and bawled a couple times. I scolded him again. Reuben came over, leering at me. He said, "You give up?" I didn't answer. Little Ann once again started searching for the lost trail. Old Dan wanted to help her. Rainey said, "I told you that you couldn't tree the ghost coon. Why don't you pay off so we can go home?" I told him I hadn't given up. My dogs were still hunting. When they gave up, I would too. Reuben said, "Well, we're not going to stay here all night." Looking back at the tree, I thought perhaps I had overlooked something. I told Reuben I was going to climb it again. He laughed. "Go ahead. Won't do any good. You climbed it once. Ain't you satisfied?" "No, I'm not satisfied," I said. "I just don't believe in ghost coons." Reuben said, "I don't believe in ghosts either. But facts are facts. To tell you the truth, I've climbed that tree a dozen times, and there just ain't no place in it for a coon to hide." Rainey spoke up. "Our old blue hounds treed that ghost coon in this tree more times than one. Maybe you two don't believe in ghosts, but I do. Why don't you pay off so we can get away from here?" "I'll climb it one more time," I said. "If I can't find him, I'll pay off." Climbing up again, I searched and searched. When I got through, I knew the ghost coon wasn't in that tree. When I came down, I saw my dogs had given up. That took the last resistance out of me. I knew if they couldn't find the ghost coon, I couldn't. Digging the two $1 bills out of my pocket, I walked over to Reuben. Little Ann was by my side. I handed my money over, saying, "Well, you won it fair and square." With a grin on his face, Reuben took my money. He said, "I bet this will break your old grandpa's heart." I didn't reply. Reaching down, I caught Little Ann's head in my hands. Looking into her warm, friendly eyes, I said, "It's all right, little girl. We haven't given up yet. We'll come back. We may never catch the ghost coon, but we'll run him until he leaves the country." She licked my hands and whined. A small breeze began to stir. Glancing up into the tree, I saw some leaves shaking. I said to Reuben, "Looks like the wind's coming up. It may blow up a storm. We'd better be heading for home." Just as I turned, I saw little Ann throw up her head and whine. Her body grew stiff and taut. I watched her. She was testing the wind. I knew she had scented something in the breeze. Stiff-legged, head high in the air, she started walking toward the tree. Almost there, she turned back and stopped. I knew she had caught the scent, but could only catch it when the breeze came. Looking at Reuben, I said, I haven't lost that $2 yet. Another breeze drifted out of the river bottoms. The land caught the scent again. Slowly, she walked straight to the large gatepost, reared up on it with her front feet, and bawled the most beautiful tree bark I ever heard in my life. Old Dan, not understanding why little Ann was bawling, stood and looked. He walked over to the post, reared up on it, and sniffed. Then, raising his head, he shook the dead leaves in the bur oak tree with his deep voice. I looked at Rainey, laughing. I said, there's your ghost coon. Now what do you think of my dogs? For once, he made no reply. Going over to the post, I saw it was a large black locust, put there many years ago to hang the gate. Looking up at the tree, I saw how the ghost coon had pulled his trick. One large long limb ran out and hung directly over the gate. It was a drop of a good 12 feet from the branch to the top of the gatepost. But I knew we weren't after an ordinary coon. This was the ghost coon. I said to Reuben, boost me up, I'll see if the post is hollow. After breaking off a long Jimson weed, I used it as a prod. I got up on Reuben's shoulder, and he raised me up. The post was hollow. Not knowing how far down the hole went, I started the switch down. About halfway, I felt something soft. I gave a hard jab. I heard him coming. He boiled right out in my face. I let go of everything, hitting the ground. I rolled over on my back and looked up. For a split second, the ghost coon stayed on top of the post, and then he jumped. My dogs were on him in the instant he hit the ground, and the fight was on. I knew the coon didn't have a chance, as he wasn't in the waters of the river. He didn't give up easily, even though he was on dry land. He was fighting for his life, and a good account he gave. He fought his way to freedom and made it back to the bur oak tree. He was a good 6 feet up on the side when old Dan leaped high in the air, caught him, and pulled him back down. At the foot of the tree, the fight went on. Again, the ghost coon fought his way free. This time, he made it and disappeared in the dark shadows of the tree. Old Dan was furious. Never before had I seen a coon get away from him. I told Reuben I would climb up and run him out. As I started climbing up, I saw little Ann go to one side and old Dan the other. My dogs would never stay together when they had treated coon. So that way, when he left a tree, he was met up by one of them. About halfway up, far out on a limb, I found the ghost coon. As I started toward him, my dog stopped bawling. I heard something I'd heard many times. The sound was like the cry of a small baby. It was the cry of a ring-tailed coon when he knows he's at the end of the trail. I never liked to hear this cry, but it was all in the game, the hunter and the hunted. As I sat there on the limb, looking at the old fella, he cried again. Something came over me. I didn't want to kill him. I hollered down and told Reuben I didn't want to kill the ghost coon. He hollered back, Are you crazy? I told him I wasn't crazy. I just didn't want to kill him. I climbed down. Reuben was mad. He said, What's the matter with you? Nothing, I told him. I just don't have the heart to kill the coon. I told him there was plenty more. Why kill him? He had lived here a long time, and more than one hunter had listened to the voices of his hounds bawling on his trail. Rainey said, He's chicken-livered. That's what it is. I didn't like that, but not wanting to argue, I didn't say anything. Reuben said, I'll go up and run him out. I won't let my dogs kill him, I said. Reuben glared at me. I'm going up and run that coon out, he said. If you stop your dogs, I'm going to beat you half to death. Do it anyway, Reuben, Rainey said. Well, I've a good mind to, said Reuben. Just as Reuben started to climb the tree, old Dan growled. He was staring into the darkness. Something was coming. What's that? I asked. Oh, no, Reuben said. Don't sound like anything I ever heard. It's ghosts, Rainey said. Let's get away from here. An animal was coming out of the darkness. It was walking slowly in an odd way, as if it were walking sideways. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, straight out. And as the animal came closer, Rainey said, Why, it's old Blue. How'd he get loose? It was a big blue tick hound. Around his neck was a piece of rope about 3 feet long. One could see that the rope had been gnawed in two. The frayed end had become entangled in a fair-sized dead limb. Dragging the limb was what made the dog look so odd. I felt much better when I found out what it was. The blue tick hound was like the Pritchards, mean and ugly. He was a big dog, tall and heavy. His chest was thick and solid. He came up growling. The hair on his back was standing straight up. He walked stiff-legged around old Dan, showing his teeth. I told Rainey he better get a hold of his dog, or there was sure to be a fight. "You better get a hold of your dog," he said. "I'm not worried about old Blue. He can take care of himself." I said no more. "Don't make no difference now whether you kill the ghost coon or not," Reuben said. "Old Blue will take care of him." I knew the killing of the coon was out of my control, but I didn't want to see him die. I said to Reuben, "Just give me back my $2 and I'll go home. I can't keep you from killing him, but I don't have to stay and see it." "Reuben, don't give him his money," Rainey said. "He ain't killed the coon." "That's right," Reuben said. "You ain't, and I wouldn't let you now even if you wanted to." I told them my dogs had treed the ghost coon, and that was the bet, to tree the ghost coon. "No, it wasn't," Reuben said. "You said you would kill him." "It was no such thing," I said. "I've done all I said I would." Reuben walked up in front of me. He said, "I ain't gonna give you the money. You didn't win it fair. Now, what are you gonna do about it?" I looked into his mean eyes. I started to make some reply, but I decided against it. He saw my hesitation and said, "You better get your dogs and get out of here before you get whipped." In a loud voice, Rainey said, "Bloody's nose, Reuben." I was scared. I couldn't whip Reuben. He was too big for me. I started to run and leave when I thought of what my grandfather had told me. "You'd better remember what my grandpa said," I reminded them. "He'll do just what he said he would." Reuben didn't hit me. He just grabbed me with his brute strength and threw me down on the ground. He had me on my back with my arms outspread. He had a knee on each arm. I made no effort to fight back. I was scared. "If you say one word to your grandpa about this," Reuben said, "I'll catch you a-hunting some night. Take my knife to you." Looking up into his ugly face, I knew he would do just what he said. I told him to let me up, and I'd go and not say anything to anyone. "Don't let him up, Reuben," Rainey said. "Beat the heck out of him, or hold him and let me do it." Just then I heard growling and a commotion off to one side. The blue hound had finally gotten a fight out of old Dan. Turning my head sideways, I could see them standing on their hind legs, tearing and slashing at each other. The weight of the big blue hound pushed old Dan over. I told Reuben to let me up so he could stop the fight. He laughed. "While my dog's whipping yours, I think I'll just work you over a little." So saying, he jerked my cap off and started whipping me in the face with it. I heard Rainey yell, "Reuben, they're killing old Blue!" Reuben jumped off me. I clambered up and looked over at the fight. What I saw thrilled me. Faithful little Ann, girl though she was, had gone to the assistance of old Dan. I knew my dogs were very close to each other. Everything they did was done as a combination, but I'd never expected this. It was a very rare occasion for a female dog, to fight another dog, but fight she did. I could see that little Ann's jaws were glued to the throat of the big hound. She would never loosen the deadly hold until the last breath of life was gone. Old Dan was tearing and slashing at the soft belly. I knew the destruction of his long, sharp teeth, his long, sharp teeth were causing. Again, Rainey yelled, "Reuben, they're killing him! They're killing old Blue! Do something quick!" Reuben darted over to one side, grabbed my axe from the ground, and said in a loud voice, "I'll kill them dang hounds!" At the thought of what he was going to do with the axe, I screamed and ran for my dogs. Reuben was about 10 feet ahead of me, bent over, running with the axe held out in front of him. I knew I could never get to them in time. I was screaming, "No, Reuben, no!" I saw the small stick when it whipped up from the ground. As if it were alive, it caught between Reuben's legs. I saw him fall. I ran on by. Reaching the dogfight, I saw the big hound was almost gone. He had long since ceased fighting. His body lay stretched full length on the ground. I grabbed old Dan's collar and pulled him back. It was different with little Ann. Pulled as I might, she wouldn't let go of the hound's throat. Her jaws were locked. I turned old Dan loose, and getting astraddle of little Ann, I pried her jaws apart with my hands. Old Dan had darted back in, grabbing his collar again. I pulled them off to one side. The blue hound lay where he was. I thought perhaps he was already dead, and then I saw him move a little. Still holding my dogs by their collars, I looked back. I couldn't understand what I saw. Reuben was laying where he had fallen. His back was towards me, and his body was bent in a U shape. Rainey was standing on the other side of him, staring down. I hollered and asked Rainey, "What's the matter?" He didn't answer. He just stood as though in a trance, staring down at Reuben. I hollered again, and he still didn't answer. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't turn my dogs loose. They would go for the hound again. Again, I hollered at Rainey, asking him to come and help me. He neither moved nor answered. I had to do something. Looking around, my glance fell on the old barbed wire fence. I led my dogs to it. Holding on to their collars with one hand, I worked a rusty barbed wire backwards and forwards against a staple until it broke. Running the end of it under their collars, I tied them up. They made 2 or 3 lunges toward the hound, but the wire held. I walked over and stopped at Rainey's side. I again asked, "What's the matter?" He said not a word. I could see that Rainey was paralyzed with fright. His mouth and eyes were open wide, and his face was as white as chalk. I laid my hand on his shoulder. At the touch of my hand, he jumped and screamed. Still screaming, he turned and started running. I watched him until he disappeared in the darkness. Looking down at Reuben, I saw what had paralyzed Rainey. When Reuben had tripped, he had fallen on the axe. As it entered his stomach, the sharp blade had sunk to the eye of the double-bitted axe. Turning my back to the horrible sight, I closed my eyes. The muscles in my stomach knotted and jerked. A nauseating sickness spread over my body. I couldn't look at him. I heard Reuben whisper. Turning around, I knelt down by his side. With my back to the axe, I couldn't understand what he was whispering. Kneeling down closer, I heard and understood. In a faint voice, he said, "Take it out of me." I hesitated. Again he pleaded, "Please, take it out of me." Turning around, I saw his hands were curled around the protruding blade, as he himself had tried to pull it from his stomach. How I did it, I'll never know. Putting my hands over his and pressing down, I pulled the axe from the wound. The blood gushed. I felt the warm heat as it spread over my hands. Again, the sickness came over me. I stumbled to my feet and stepped back a few paces. Seeing a movement from Reuben, I thought he was going to get up. With his hands, he pushed himself halfway up. His eyes were wide open, staring straight at me, stopping in his effort of getting up, still staring at me. His mouth opened as if to say something. Words never came. Instead, a large red bubble slowly worked its way out of his mouth and burst. He fell back to the ground. I knew he was dead. Scared, not knowing what to do, I called for Rainey. I got no answer. I called his name again and again. I could get no reply. My voice echoed in the darkness of the silent night. A cold chill ran over my body. I suppose it's natural at night like that for a boy to think of his mother. I thought of mine. I wanted to get home. Going over to my dogs, I glanced up to where the blue hound was. He was trying to get up. I was glad he wasn't dead. Picking up my lantern, I thought of my axe. I left it. I didn't care if I ever saw it, never saw it again. Knowing I couldn't turn my dogs loose, I broke off enough of the wire to lead them. As I passed under the branches of the bur oak tree, I looked up into the dark foliage, and I could see the bright eyes of the ghost coon. Everything that had happened on this terrible night was because of his very existence, but it wasn't his fault. I also knew he was a silent witness to the horrible scene behind. Behind me lay the still body of a young boy. On my left, a blue tick hound lay torn and bleeding. Even after all that had happened, I could feel no hatred for the ghost coon, and was not sorry I had let him live. Arriving home, I awakened my mother and father. Starting at my grandfather's meal, I told everything that had happened. I left nothing out. My mother had started crying long before I completed my story. Papa said nothing, just sat there and listened. When I had finished, he kept staring down at the floor in deep thought. I could hear the sobbing of my mother in the silence. I walked over to her. She put her arms around me and said, "My poor little boy." Getting to his feet, Papa reached for his coat and hat. Mama asked him where he was going. Well, I'll have to go up there, he said. I'm going to get Grandpa, for he's the only man in the country that has the authority to move the body. Looking at me, he said, "You go across the river and get old man Lowry, and you may as well go on up and tell the Bufords too. Tell them to meet us at your grandfather's place." I hurried to carry the sad message. The following day was a nasty one. A slow, cold drizzle had set in. Feeling trapped indoors, I prowled from room to room. I couldn't understand why my father hadn't come back from the Pritchards. I sat by the window and watched the road. Understanding my feelings, Mama said, "Billy, I wouldn't worry. He'll be back before long. It takes time for things like that." "I know," I said, "but you would think that he would have been back by now." Time dragged slowly by. Late in the afternoon, I saw Papa coming. Our old mule was jogging along. Water was shooting out from underneath his feet in small squirts at every step. Papa had tied the halter rope around the mule's neck. He was sitting humped over, with his hands jammed deep in his pockets of his patched and worn Mackinaw. Guys, a Mackinaw is a brand of coat. I felt sorry for him. He was soaking wet, tired, sleepy, and hungry. Telling Mama, "Here he is," I grabbed my jumper and cap and ran out to the gate and waited. I was going to ask him what had happened to the Pritchards, but on seeing his tired face and wet clothes, I said, "Papa, you'd better go in to the fire. I'll take care of the mule and do the feeding and milking." "That would be fine," he said. After doing the chores, I hurried to the house. I couldn't wait any longer. I had to find out what had happened. Walking into the front room, I saw my father had changed his clothes. He was standing in front of the fireplace drinking coffee. "Boy, that's bad weather, isn't it?" he said. I said it was and asked him about Reuben. "We went to the old tree and got Reuben's body," Papa said. "We were on our way back to the Pritchards when we met them. They were just this side of their place. They had started to look for him. Rainey had been so dazed when he got home, they couldn't make out what he was trying to tell them. But they knew it must have been something bad. They wanted to know what happened. I did my best to explain the accident. It hit old man Pritchard pretty hard. I felt sorry for him." Mama asked how Mrs. Pritchard had taken it. Papa said he didn't know, as he never did get to see any of the women folks. He said they were the funniest bunch he'd ever seen. He couldn't understand them. There wasn't one tear shed that he could see. All the men had stayed out at the barn. They never had been invited in for a cup of coffee or anything. Mama said Mama asked when they were to have the funeral. "They have their own graveyard right there on the place," Papa said. Old man Pritchard said they would take care of everything and didn't want to bother people. He said it was too far for anyone to come, and it was bad weather too. Mama said she couldn't help feeling sorry for Mrs. Pritchard and wished they were more friendly. I asked Papa about Rainey. Papa said, according to what old man Pritchard said, Rainey just couldn't seem to get over the shock. They were figuring on taking him into town to see the doctor. In a stern voice, Papa said, "Billy, I don't want you fooling around with the Pritchards anymore. You have plenty of country around here, so you don't have to go up there to hunt." I said I wouldn't. I felt bad about the death of Reuben. I didn't feel like hunting. I kept having bad dreams. I couldn't forget the way he looked at me just before he died. I moped and wandered around in a daze. I wanted to do something, but didn't know what it was. I explained my feelings to my mother. She said, "Billy, I feel the same way, and I'd like to do something to help, but I guess there's nothing we can do. There are people like the Pritchards all through the hills. They live in little worlds of their own and are all alone. They don't like to have outsiders interfere." I told my mother, "I've been thinking about how dangerous it was to carry an axe while hunting, and I've decided I'd save a few coon hides and get a good gun." Boy, I shouldn't have mentioned getting a gun. My mother got sitting hen mad. "You're not getting a gun," she said. "I won't have that at all. I told you a long time ago. You could have one when you were 21 years old, and I mean just that. I worry enough about you out there in them hills all hours of the night, running and jumping, but I couldn't stand it if I knew you had a gun with you. No, sir. You can just forget about a gun. Yes, Mama, I said, and sulked off to my room. Lying on my bed, still trying to figure out what I could do to help, I glanced over to the wall. There, tied in a small bundle, was just what I needed. Some time back, my sisters had made some flowers for Decoration Day. Guys, this is what they used to call Veterans Day. They had given me a small bouquet for my room. Taking them down, I could see they had faded a little. I'm sorry, guys, not Veterans Day, Memorial Day. My bad. Taking them down, I could see they had faded a little and looked rather old, but they were still pretty. I blew the dust off and straightened the crinkled petals. Putting them inside my shirt, I left the house. I hadn't gone far when I heard something behind me. It was my dogs. I tried to tell them I wasn't going hunting. I just had a little business to attend to. And if they'd go back, I'd take them out that night. It was no use. They couldn't understand. Circling around through the flats, I came to the hollow above the Pritchard's place. Down below me, I could see the graveyard and the fresh mound of dirt. As quietly as I could, I started easing myself down the mountainside. Old Dan loosed a rock. The further it bounced, the louder it got. It slammed up against a post oak tree and sounded like a gunshot. I held my breath and watched the house. No one came out. I glared at old Dan. He wagged his tail just to show off. He sat down on his rear and started digging at a flea with his hind leg. The way his leg was thumping in the leaves, anyone would have heard it for a mile. I waited until he quit thumping before starting on. Reaching the bottom, I had about 20 yards of clearing to cross, but the grass and bushes were pretty thick. Laying down on my stomach with my heart beating like a trip hammer, I wiggled my way to Reuben's grave. I laid the flowers on the fresh mound of earth and then turned around and scooted for the timber. Just as we reached the mountaintop, my foot slipped and I kicked loose a large rock. Down the side of the mountain it rolled. This time, the blue tick hound heard the noise. He came out from under the house, bawling. I heard a door slam and Mrs. Pritchard came out. She stood looking this way and that. The hound ran up to the graveyard and started sniffing and bawling. Mrs. Pritchard followed him. Seeing the flowers on Reuben's grave, she picked them up and looked at them. She scolded the hound and then looked up at the hillside. I knew she couldn't see me because the timber was too thick, but I felt uncomfortable anyway. Scolding the hound again, she knelt down and arranged the flowers on the grave. Taking one more look at the hillside, she started back. Halfway to the house, I saw her reach down and gather the long cotton skirt in her hand and dab at her eyes. I felt much better after paying my respects to Reuben. Everything looked brighter, and I didn't have the funny feeling anymore. All the way home, my dogs kept running out in front of me. They would stop, turn around, and look at me. I had to smile, for I knew what they wanted. I stopped and petted them a little and told them that as soon as I got home and had my supper, we would go hunting. Chapter 14. A few days later, on his way back from the mill, one of the Hatfield boys stopped at our place. He told me my grandfather wanted to see me. It was unusual for Grandpa to send for me, and it had me worried. I figured that he wanted to talk to me about the death of Reuben Pritchard. I always enjoyed talking to my grandpa, but I didn't want to talk about Reuben's death. Every time I thought of him, I lived the horrible tragedy all over again. After a practically sleepless night, the next morning, I started for the store. I was walking along, deep in thought, when little Ann zipped by me. She was happy as a young gray squirrel. She wiggled and twisted, and once she barked at me. I looked behind me, and there was old Dan trotting along. He stopped when I turned around. Little Ann came up to me. I scolded them and tried to explain that I wasn't going hunting. I was just going up to the store to see what Grandpa wanted. They couldn't or didn't want to understand. I picked up a small stick and slapped my legs with it. In a deep voice, I said, "Now you go home or I'm going to wear you out." This hurt their feelings. With their tails between their legs and trotting side by side, they started back. Every little way they would stop and look back at me. It was too much. I couldn't stand it. I began to feel bad all over. "Well, all right," I said. "Come on, you can go. But Dan, If there are any dogs around that store and you get in a fight, I won't take you hunting for a whole year, and I mean that. Although I knew I didn't. They came a-running, tickled to death. Little Ann took one of her silly spells. She started nipping at the long red tail of old Dan. Not getting any reaction from him, she jumped over him. She barked at him. He wouldn't even look at her. She ran around in front of him and laid down in the trail, acting like a cat ready to spring. Stiff-legged, he walked up close to her, stopped, and showed his teeth. I laughed out loud. I knew he wouldn't bite her any more than he would bite me. He was just acting tough because he was being a boy dog. After several attempts to get him to play, Little Ann gave up. Together, they started sniffing around the underbrush. As I walked up in front of the store, Grandpa hollered at me from the barn. I went over to him. Right away, he wanted to know about Reuben's accident. He listened while I told the story over again. After I had my say, Grandpa stood looking down at the ground. There was a deep frown on his face and a hurt look in his eyes. His quietness made me feel uneasy. He finally raised his head and looked at me. What I could see in his friendly old face tore at my heart. It seemed that there were many more wrinkles than I had ever seen before. He uncombed his iron gray hair. His uncombed iron gray hair looked almost white. I noticed that his wrinkled old hand trembled as he rubbed the wire-stiff stubble on his chin. In a low voice that quivered as he talked, he said, "Billy, I'm sorry about all this. Truly sorry. I can't help but feel that in some way it was my fault." "No, Grandpa," I said. "It wasn't your fault." "It wasn't anyone's fault. It just happened and no one could help it." "I know," he said. "But if I hadn't called Reuben's bet, nothing would have happened. I guess when a man gets old and doesn't think straight, I shouldn't have let those boys get under my skin." "Grandpa," I said, "Reuben and Rainey could get under anybody's skin. You couldn't help that." "Why, they get under everyone's skin that gets close to them." "Yeah, I know," he said. "But still, I acted like a fool. Billy, I had no idea things were going to turn out like they did, or I wouldn't have called that bet." Wanting to change the conversation, I said, "Grandpa, we won that bet fair and square, but they took my money anyway." I saw the fire come back in his eyes. This made me feel better. He was more like the grandpa I loved. "That's all right," he said. "We'll just forget the whole thing." He stepped over and laid his hand on my shoulder, and in a solemn voice he said, "We won't talk about this again. Now, I want you to forget it ever happened because it wasn't your fault." "Oh, I know it's hard for a boy to ever completely forget something like that. Although through your life, you'll think of it now and then, but try not to let it bother you, and don't ever feel guilty about it. It's not good for a young boy to feel that way." I nodded my head, thinking if people would just stop questioning me about Reuben's death, maybe I could forget. Grandpa said, "Well, the accident wasn't the only thing I wanted to talk to you about. I got something else. Something I think will help us both forget a lot of things." The twinkle in Grandpa's eyes reminded me of what my father had said. "Seems like that old man can cook up more deals than anyone in the country." I didn't care how many deals Grandpa cooked up. He was still the best grandpa in the whole wide world. "What have you got?" I asked. "Come over to the store," he said. "I'll show you." On our way over, I heard him mutter, "I hope this doesn't turn out like the ghost coon hunt." On entering the store, Grandpa walked to the post office department and came back with a newspaper in his hand, and he spread it out on the counter. Pointing with his finger, he said in a loud voice, "Look there." I looked. The large black letters read, "Championship Coon Hunt to be held." My eyes popped open. Again, I read the words. Grandpa was chuckling. I said, "Boy, if this isn't something, a championship coon hunt?" Wide-eyed, I asked, "Why are they having this hunt? And what does it have to do with us?" Grandpa was getting excited. Off came his glasses, and out came the old red handkerchief. He blew his breath on the lenses and polished them. He snorted a time or two, reared back, and almost shouted, "Do with us? Why, it has everything to do with us. All my life I've wanted to go to one of these big coon hunts. Why, I've even dreamed about it, and now the opportunity has come. Yes, sir, now I can go." He paused. "That is, if it's all right with you." I was dumbfounded. I said, all right with me? Well, Grandpa, you know it's all right with me, but what have I got to do with it? Grandpa was so excited I thought he was going to burst a blood vessel. Talking excitedly, he said, I've got it all fixed, Billy. We can enter the old Dan and little Ann in this championship hunt. I was so surprised at what Grandpa had said, I couldn't utter a word. At first I was scared, and then a wonderful feeling came over me. I felt the excitement of the big hunt as it burned its way into my body. I started breathing like I'd been running for 100 miles. After several attempts, I croaked, can just any dog be in this hunt? Grandpa almost jumped as he answered, no, sir, not just any hound can be entered. They have to be the best, and they have to be registered too. He started talking with his hands. Pointing to a chair, he said, sit down, and I'll tell you all about it. Grandpa calmed down a little and started talking in a serious voice. Billy, he said, it takes some doing to have a set of dogs entered in this hunt. I've been working on this for months. I've written letters on top of letters. I've even had several good friends in town helping me. You see, I've kept a record of all the coons your dogs have caught, and believe me, their catch is up there with the best of them. Now, I've already paid the entry fee and everything's fixed. All we have to do is go. Entry fee? How much did it cost? I asked. You let me worry about that, he said. Now what do you say? You want to give it a whirl? I understand the winner receives a gold cup. And you never can tell. We might come home with it. We have a good chance as anyone else. Grandpa had me worked up by this time, I didn't think anyone else had any good hounds but me. I reared back and blurted out, it's all right with me, Grandpa. Just tell me what to do. Grandpa flew out of gear like a Model T Ford. He slapped the counter with his hand, and in a pent-up voice he said, that boy, that's the way. I like to hear a coon hunter talk. With a questioned look on his face, he asked, didn't I see your dogs with you when you came up? Yes, sir. They followed me, I said. They're outside. Well, call them in, he said. I've got something for them. I called them in. Little Ann came in the store, walking like she was scared. Old Dan came to the door and stopped. I tried to coax him in. It was no use. My dogs, never being allowed in the house, were scared to come in. Grandpa walked over to a hoop of cheese and cut off 2 chunks about the size of my fist. He walked to the door, talking to old Dan. What's the matter, boy? He said. You scared to come in? Well, that shows you're a good dog. He handed him a piece of cheese. I heard it rattle in his throat as he gulped it down. Grandpa came back and set little Ann up on the counter. He chuckled as he broke the cheese up in small pieces and fed her. Yes, sir, he said. I think we have the best darn coon hounds in these here Ozark Mountains. And just as sure as shooting, we're going to win that gold cup. Grandpa didn't have to say that. The way I was feeling, I already had the cup. All I had to do was go and get it. Finished with his feeding of little Ann, Grandpa said, now, let's see. The hunt starts on the 23rd. That's about, well, let's see. This is the 17th. Counting on his fingers, he finally figured it out. That's 6 days from now, he said in a jubilant voice. I nodded my head. We can leave here early on the morning of the 22nd, he said. And barring accidents, we should make the campground plenty of time for the grand opening. I asked how we were going. Go in my buggy, he said. I'll load the tent and everything the night before. I asked him what he wanted me to bring. Nothing, he said. But these 2 little hounds, and you be here early. And I believe I'd let these dogs rest because we want them in tip-top shape when we get there. I saw the thinking wrinkles bunch up on Grandpa's forehead. You reckon your daddy'd like to go? He asked. As late as it is in the fall, I don't think he's too busy, is he? No, our crops are all gathered, I said. We've been clearing some of the bottom land, but that's almost done now. Well, ask him, he said. Tell him I'd like to have him go. I'll ask him, I said. But you know how Papa is. The farm comes first with him. I know, Grandpa said. But you ask him anyway, and tell him what I said. Now it's getting late, and you'd better be heading for home. I was almost to the door when Grandpa said, wait a minute. He walked over behind the candy counter and shook out one of the quarter sacks. He filled it up to the brim, bounced it on the counter a few times, and dropped in a few more gumdrops. With a twinkle in his eye and a smile on his face, he handed it over to me, saying, save some for your sisters. I was so choked up I couldn't say anything. I took it and flew out the door, calling to my dogs. On my way home, I didn't talk. I didn't walk on the ground. I was way up in the clouds, just skipping along. With a song, I told the sycamore trees and the pop-eyed gray squirrels how happy I was. The land sensed my happiness. She pranced along on the trail with a doggish grin on her face. She begged for a piece of candy, which I gladly gave her. Even old Dan felt the pleasant atmosphere. His long red tail fanned the air. Once he raised his head and bawled. I stood still and listened to the droning tones of his deep voice. The sound seemed to be trapped for an instant in the thick timber. It rolled around under the tall white sycamores, beat its way through the wild cane, and found freedom out over the clear blue waters of the river. The sound, following the river's course, rolled like the beat of a jungle drum. As the echo died away in the distance, silence settled over the bottoms. The gray squirrels stopped their chattering. The wild birds quit their singing. I stood still. No sound could be heard. It seemed that all the creatures of the wild were holding their breath. I gazed up to the towering heights of the tall trees. No leaf was stirring. The silence seemed strained and expectant, like a young boy waiting for a firecracker to explode. I looked at old Dan. He was standing perfectly still, with his right foot raised and his long ears fanned open. He seemed to be listening and challenging any living creature to make a noise. The silence was broken by the of a red-tailed hawk. This seemed to be a signal. All around me, the happy atmosphere resumed its natural state. I heard the of a woodpecker high in the top of the box elder sang. The cry of a kingfisher and the scream of a blue jay blended perfectly with the drum-like beat. The barking red squirrel, glued to the side of the hackberry tree, kept time to the music with the beat of his tail. Each noise I heard and each sight I saw was very familiar to me, but I never grew tired of listening and watching. They were a God-sent gift, and I enjoyed them all. As I skipped along, it was hard for me to realize all the wonderful things that had happened to me in such a few short years. I had two of the finest little hounds that ever bawled on the trail of a ringtail coon. I had a wonderful mother and father and three little sisters. I had the best grandpa a boy ever had, and to top it all, I was going to a championship coon hunt. It was no wonder that my heart was bursting with happiness. Wasn't I the luckiest boy in the world? Everyone was just sitting down to supper. When I got home, my sisters quit the table for the candy. I told them to divide it equally. The oldest one asked if I wanted any of it. No, I said, I brought it for you all. Of course, I didn't tell them about the 4 pieces I had in my pocket. They thanked me with their clear blue eyes. I guess it's pretty hard for a young boy to fool his mama. She took one look at me and called me over. She ruffled up my hair, kissed me, and said, if my little boy's eyes get any bigger, they're going to pop right out of his head. Now tell me, what are you so happy about? Before I could say anything, Papa chuckled and asked, what's going on between you and your grandpa? What are you and that old man cooking up? As fast as I could talk, I started telling about the big coon hunt. I told how Grandpa had been working to have my dogs entered and how he had already paid my entry fee. Catching my breath and looking up at Papa, I said, we're going in his buggy, and he wants you to go. I waited in silence for his reply. Papa sat there, staring off into space, sipping his coffee and saying nothing. I knew he was thinking. In the silence, I was sure I could hear my heart thumping. I said, Papa, please go. We'll have a lot of fun. And besides, the winner receives a big gold cup. He scratched his head and said, Billy, I'd sure like to go, but I don't see how I can with all this work around here. I was beginning to think that Papa wasn't going to go, and then Mama started talking. Work? She said. Why, all the work is practically done. I don't know of one thing you couldn't put off for a few days. Why don't you go? You haven't been anywhere since I don't know when. Well, it's not only the work I'm thinking of, Papa said. It's you and the girls. Why, don't worry about the girls and me, Mama said. We'll be all right. Besides, it'll be several months yet before I need any help. When Mama said this, it dawned on me. I'd been so busy with my coon hunting, I hadn't noticed anything unusual. Mama's tummy was all swelled up. She was going to have a baby. I felt guilty for not having noticed. I went over and put my arms around her and kissed her. Papa spoke up. Sure, it's sure going to be a big hunt, he said. I heard something about it up at the store one day. Grandpa said there'd be hunters there from everywhere, I said, and some of the best coonhounds in the country. Do you think you'd have a chance to win the cup? Papa asked. I started to answer him when the little one piped up. They can't beat old Dan Little Ann, she said. I just bet they can't. Everyone laughed at her serious remark. I would have kissed her, but she ate candy, cornbread, and molasses all over her face. I told Papa I didn't know how good those dogs were, but there was one thing I did know. If they beat mine, they would have to hunt harder than they had ever hunted before. After I'd had my say about the dogs, a silence settled over the dining room. Everyone was looking at Papa and waiting for his answer. I saw a pleased smile spread over his face. He stood up. All right, I'll go, he said. And by golly, we'll bring that gold cup back too. My sisters started clapping their hands and squealing with delight. A satisfied smile spread over my mother's face. At that moment, I'm sure no boy in the world could have been happier than I. Tears of happiness rolled down my cheeks. Mama wiped them away with her apron. In the midst of all the excitement, my little sister, not saying a word, climbed down from her chair. No one said anything. We just watched her. Still clutching a spoon in her small hand, she came around the table and walked up to me. Looking down at the floor, in a bashful voice, she asked, Can I have the gold cup? Putting my finger under her sticky little chin, I tilted her head up. I smiled as I looked into her clear blue eyes. I said, Honey, if I win it, I'll give it to no one but you. I had to cross my heart and hope to die several times before she was satisfied. Back in her chair, she gloated to the others. You just wait and see, she said. It'll be all mine. Nobody's but mine, and I'll put my banty eggs in it. Silly, you don't put banty eggs in a gold cup, the oldest one said. They're just made to look at. That night I dreamed about gold cups and little red hounds and coons as big as rain barrels. Once I woke myself up whooping to my dogs. The next few days were busy ones for me. Knowing that Papa and I would be gone for several days, I did everything I could to make things convenient for Mama. I chopped a large pile of wood and stacked it close to the kitchen door. To make it easier for her to feed our stock, I cut some poles from the hillside and boxed up one of the stalls in the barn. I filled it full of hay so she wouldn't have to climb the ladder to the loft. Papa laid down the law to my sisters about being good and helping Mama while we were gone. The day before we were to leave, I was nervous as a June bug in a henhouse. The day seemed endless. A few of the miserable hours were spent talking to my dogs. I told them all about the big hunt and how important it was. Now, if you don't win the gold cup, I said, I won't be mad because I know you'll do your best. Old Dan wouldn't even look at me. He paid no attention to what I said. He was sulking because I hadn't been taking him hunting. When I talked to little Ann, it was different. She listened and seemed to understand everything I said. I dreaded to go to bed at night. I thought sleep would be impossible. I must have been more tired than I thought I was. I fell asleep almost immediately. Old Red, our rooster, woke me at daybreak, crowing his full head off. It was a beautiful morning, clear and frosty. After a good breakfast, we kissed Mama goodbye and started for the store. I'm sure there were a lot of coon hunters in the Ozarks, but on that morning, none could have felt as big and as important as I. Walking along by the side of my father, I threw out my chest and tried hard to keep pace with his long strides. He noticed and laughed. Well, you'll have to grow a little bit, he said, before you can take steps that long. I didn't say anything. I just smiled. Hearing a noise overhead, I looked up. The gray ones were winging their way southward. I listened to their talking and wondered what they were saying. Looking to the mountains around us, I saw the mysterious artist who comes at night had paid us a visit. I wondered how he could paint so many different colors in one night: red, wine, yellow, and rust. My dogs were trotting along in front of us. I smiled at the way their hindquarters shifted to the right. Little Ann would jump and bounce and try to get old Dan to play, but the solemn old boy just jogged along, heedless of everything. You know, Papa said, she doesn't even act like a hound. She's bouncing and playing all the time. Why, she acts more like a little pup than a hound. Yeah, I know, I said. I've noticed that myself, but you know one thing, Papa? She's the smartest dog I've ever seen. Why, some of the things she does are almost unbelievable. Yes, I know, said Papa. But still, it's strange. Very strange. There's only one thing wrong with her, Papa, I said. Yeah, what's that? He asked. You won't believe it, I said. But she's gun shy. Gun shy? How do you know she's gun shy? Papa asked. I didn't know for a long time, I said, until one day when I was hoeing corn down in the field by the old slough. She and old Dan were digging in a bank after a groundhog. Across the river, some fishermen started shooting a gun. It scared little Ann, and she came running to me, shaking all over. Oh, Papa said. Maybe you just thought she was scared. No, I didn't, Papa, I said. It happened again up at the store one day. Grandpa shot a chicken hawk. When the gun went off, it scared her half to death. No, she's gun shy, all right. Oh, well, Papa said. That doesn't mean anything. A lot of dogs are afraid of guns. I know, I said, but you wouldn't think she would be that way. I mean, if I had a gun of my own, I could break her of being gun shy. Papa looked at me. He said, From what your mother says, you won't be getting a gun for some time yet. Yeah, I know, I said. When we reached the store, we saw the team was already hitched to the buggy and was standing in front of the store. Grandpa had loaded the tent and several boxes of groceries. I had never seen him in such high spirits. He slapped Papa on the back, saying, I'm sure glad you could go with us. It'll do you good to get out once in a while. Papa laughed and said, It looked like I had to go or have everyone in the family mad at me. Looking at the buggy, I saw my axe. I didn't think I ever wanted to see it again, but for some reason it didn't look like I thought it would. There was no blood on it, and it looked harmless enough, laying there, all clean and bright. Grandpa saw me looking at it. He came over. I kept it a few days, he said, just in case the marshal wanted to ask questions. Everything seemed to be all right now, and we may need a good axe on this hunt. Grandpa sensed how I felt about the axe. He waited in silence for my answer. The excitement of the hunt was so strong in me, even the sight of the axe brought back only a fleeting remembrance of Reuben's accident. I said, Yeah, we will need one. Besides, it's a good one, and there's no use in throwing it away. Grandpa laughed, reached over, and screwed my cap around on my head, saying, That boy, that's what I wanted you to say. Now you better go to the barn and get some hay and make a bed in the buggy box for your dogs. Oh, Grandpa, I said, they can walk. They don't ever get tired. Besides, they're used to walking. Walk? Grandpa shouted. They're not going to walk. No, sir. Not if I can help it. You want them to be sore when they get there? Papa chuckled and he said, We can't win no gold cup with two sore-footed hounds, can we? Of course not, Grandpa said. Now you go and get that hay like I said. As I turned to go to the barn, I couldn't help but smile. It made me feel good to have my Papa and Grandpa so concerned about my dogs. I had taken only a few steps when Grandpa said, Oh, wait a minute. I stopped and turned around. Walking up to me and glancing toward the house as he did, he whispered, In the empty kraut barrel in the harness room, there's a jug of corn liquor. Cover it up in the hay so your grandma won't see it and bring it back with you. With a twinkle in his eye, he said, Never can tell when we'll need some medicine. I knew my father wouldn't drink any of the liquor, but if Grandpa wanted to take along a whole barrel, it was just right with me. Just when I thought we were ready to leave, Grandma came bursting out. Grandpa got nervous. He whispered and asked, Did you hide that jug good? I nodded my head. Grandma handed Grandpa a pair of long-handled underwear and a scarf, saying, I knew you'd forget something. Grandpa snorted, but knew there was no use arguing with her. She started picking around in the groceries, asking about salt, pepper, and matches. Nanny, we've got everything, he said. You must think I'm a baby and don't know how to pack a grub box. A baby? Grandma shouted. Why, you're worse than a baby. At least they have a little sense. You don't have any at all. An old codger like you out of chasing coons all over the hills. At her biting remark, I thought Grandpa was going to blow up. He snorted like Daisy, our milk cow, when she'd seen a booger. I crawled up in the buggy box with my dogs and hung my feet out. Grandma came over and asked me about warm clothes. I told her I had plenty. She kissed me goodbye, and we were on our way.